I had a um, important call that was coming in. So, yeah, identity extremism, when it funnels down into your politics and into your leadership, it can just create a lot of challenges for the general public, for the community. Ideally, you would like your leadership and those who are voted in power to function with some sort of sense of morality. And it just gets really complicated when you're electing public officials from the general public because America really doesn't have a common ground. You're kind of just pulling from people where you don't really know their backgrounds, you don't really know what their belief system is. This is why it's so scary putting people in positions of authority and leadership in American society because we are such a polarized economy. There's really no unity in the American consensus. So you don't know what you're going to get. And this is why a lot of times people just opt out of even participating in American politics when a lot of times these very same people can be major influencers in doing the right thing. Identity extremism, again, is not just limited to race and ethnicity, even though in large part that plays a big deal in it. Extremism, identity extremism. I keep putting these AirPods in my ear and keep forgetting that the AirPods are in. These little slicksters. Identity extremism isn't just limited to race and ethnicity, it's also connected to political ideals, values, principles. When a person is fused to rigid and extreme belief systems and ideologies, and there's no sort of like wiggle room. America is a very tricky situation, a tricky social experiment, for lack of better words. People get into authority positions in this world, and a lot of times it's hit or miss if the authority figures have any sense of accountability to the general public or any accountability at all. I've always been fascinated with American politics because you're already pulling from a gene pool where you don't know the belief systems, the worldviews, the value systems of a lot of these candidates outside of what they project in the media. All you can really do is go off what they say. Yeah, I care about human rights. Yes, I care about equality. Yes, a lot of people portray idealistic values in the media as politicians, but when it comes to putting the rubber on the road, you really don't know what you're going to get. And you're already pulling from a gene pool in the US from a very divided economy, a lot of radical extremist belief systems. Then you add on top of that different generations, different eras, and it's just a mixed bag when you're voting for a presidency. You don't know the nature of the person that you're going to get. A lot of times it's picking from the lesser of the two evils. So there's a lot of controversy currently in the media um, with the United States and their involvement in Venezuela and the capturing of the Venezuelan president and his wife. There is already here a stage of a divided economy where, in the Bible, it talks a lot about how a house divided amongst itself cannot stand. And you're basically coming into a situation like this where this is the price you pay, when you're running a nation and there's any sort of corruption or any sort of like polarized division in the economy, in the society. You kind of make yourself vulnerable for being captured here, as many Venezuelans are celebrating this capture. For them, it's a mark of freedom and liberation. And for others, it's a sign or indication of illegality and compromise of morality and international law. I am no politician. However, I am a student of human behavior. And you're in a world where you can't really walk the middle ground. You kind of have to choose a side. You kind of have to, It's a very complex, multi-layered world that we live in, where the days of being an outside observer are done. You have to have stand up. You got to have a voice. You got to have a position. So here I did some research on. There's a lot of arguments of what was done being illegal. I was in the U.S. military. I was a medic for the Marine Corps, but I went in as Navy. Didn't really know a whole lot of the U.S. military and how the U.S. military works, but basically served both branches. Did my fair share of time in the Middle East, in Iraq, so I am sort of, very familiar with a lot of the politics that goes into war, some of the drastic consequences of that, having to mobilize things of that nature. So anytime there's any sort of major US decision making or things that have occurred, I'm always thinking about, man, is this another seed that's being planted where younger people are going to have to strap up, and get ready for war. And America is a very unique thing for us to be as polarized and divided as we are in terms of race, belief systems, economics, social equality. There's really no equality in the American system, but you can guarantee you're going to get treated equally when it comes to you being drafted and having to go to war. So I just thought about is, what would it hurt to do some research into this situation? So it says here legal and international law concerns many legal scholars. Legal and international law concerns. Many legal scholars, foreign governments, and international institutions have argued that the United States military operation to seize Venezuela's president, Nicolás Maduro, and his wife violated both international and U.S. law. Under international law, specifically the United Nations Charter, the use of force against another sovereign state is prohibited unless there is Security Council authorization or a legitimate self defense justification, neither of which was present in this case. International legal experts assert that capturing a sitting head of state inside his own country without consent constitutes a breach of state sovereignty and territorial integrity, which are foundational principles of the modern legal order. As one expert commentary noted, there is no justification in international law for the US action, and it sets a dangerous precedent for global norms about the use of force. One thing I know about America, once we do something that's either perceived as illegal, unjustified, not right, everybody else follows. So that was like one of the first things that came to my mind. I'm just thinking, like, oh Lord, what other countries do we have to prepare for that are going to just follow suit, right? Monkey see, monkey do politics. And essentially what they're saying is that just kind of sets precedent for just basically, you know, governments to just sort of take over, other pieces of property or other nations illegally. Um, for their justifiable reasons. Here it says constitutional and domestic law issues. Domestically within the United States, critics have argued that the president exceeded his constitutional authority by launching a military operation without a congressional authorization. Under the United States Constitution, Congress holds the power to declare war and to authorize prolonged military engagements. Unilateral action by a president to dispose of foreign leader is widely seen as falling into the category of declaring a war or a regime change, which requires legislative approval. Members of Congress from both parties raised concerns that the administration bypassed established legal checks and balances, potentially violating domestic statutes governing the use of military force. Opponents also note that even if Maduro faced indictment in U.S. courts, criminal prosecutions of foreign leaders have historically relied on extradition agreements or cooperation, not unilateral military seizure. All right. So it says here Venezuela was already deeply divided socially, politically, and economically long before the United States intervention. Years of authoritarian governance, economic collapse, migration crisis, and competing claims to leadership have fractured Venezuelan society and weakened the state's internal cohesion. These divisions made Venezuela more susceptible to external intervention. When a nation internally polarized and lacks unified national institutions, it becomes easier for powerful external actors to justify and execute force under the pretext of restoring order or combating corruption. However, this very fragility also means such an intervention can further widen societal rifts, as many Venezuelans see the action not as liberation, but as foreign aggression that undermines national sovereignty and adds another layer of resentment and instability. The house divided, quote unquote, that already existed within Venezuela arguably made it feasible for the United States, but also ensured that the consequences would be deeper polarization and international controversy. So you're already coming going into it. And the United States is smart, right? They're kind of seeing some of this division and some of these different, corrupt politics that are occurring in the nation. They already see this as a people divided. All right. They're already kind of like, hey, get this man up out of here. So in the United States mind, whether illegally or legally, it doesn't matter. We want to come here and do this for justice. And you kind of notice this in the identity extremist kind of culture where they're very big on policing others, but they're doing it from a burning house for a lack of better words, where if America already doesn't have a solution for a lot of the issues. I mean, you have African Americans here still fighting for reparations, for Christ's sake. Everybody else and their mama got reparations, but black folks who have had just centuries of history of enslavement have still not received their reparations. And there's a multitude of other issues that are going on. But here we are in all these other nations, and some people argue like, oh well, he did this for oil, or oh he did this for financial purposes. But I noticed that this is what a lot of identity extremists do. They first attack your character, all right? And you even see this in America among black folks, right? Oh, this black man was whispering at this white lady, right? And all of a sudden the community gets burnt down, all right? So it kind of starts with a character assassination. um and then from there, there's sort of like a justification of, okay, we got to take these people over. So paying attention to that, how some of these strategies of these identity extremists work here. So it says here, leadership has never been a neutral force in human history. Wherever leadership exists, whether in families, tribes, corporations, churches, or nations, it exerts a shaping influence on beliefs, behaviors, and social alignment. Leaders do not merely govern systems, they also shape narratives, define enemies and allies, and establish what is considered acceptable or intolerable. Because of this, leadership carries a moral gravity that extends far beyond policy decisions. It influences identity, unity, and collective conscience. In modern democratic societies such as the United States, leadership is uniquely powerful because it operates in the public psychological space. Presidential decisions, rhetoric, and symbolic actions are not simply administrative, they are interpreted as endorsements of values. Research in political psychology shows that citizens often experience leadership actions as affirmations or threats to their personal and group identity, making political leadership one of the most emotionally charged forces in contemporary society. When leadership decisions are perceived as controversial, inconsistent, or morally compromised, they tend to activate deep psychological fault lines within a population. Groups begin to form around agreement and opposition, often not merely on policy, but on perceived character and intent. Over time, this creates a social sorting where people increasingly associate only with those who share their political or ideological alignment, reducing empathy and mutual understanding across group lines. This fragmentation intensifies when leadership becomes corrupted, whether through self interest, deception, abuse of power, or moral incoherence. Corrupt leadership does not simply fail to unify, it actively polarizes communities. Communities begin to distrust one another, institutions lose legitimacy, and individuals disengage from shared civic spaces. History repeatedly shows that nations fracture not first through war, but through the erosion of moral authority at the top. When identity extremism is layered on top of controversial or unrighteous leadership, the consequences accelerate. Political disagreement transforms into moral absolutism. Opponents are no longer wrong, but dangerous, immoral, or irredeemable. This creates widening gaps within nations, gaps that resemble the ancient warning: a house divided against itself cannot stand. Leadership, when detached from righteousness and moral restraint, does not merely govern, it divides kingdoms. So, with every controversial leader morally compromised, it just kind of funnels down to the population. That's why when these presidents are in the White House, they are not just working the term, they are working the conscience and the psychological state of the population, being that they're only in there for all of 4 years. So It's about how much of an impact can I make on the hearts and the minds of the people that I am governing. All right. It's not just about the term that they're serving, it's about how can I make an impact and a legacy that can funnel down into the psyche of potential leaders in the future. And we're already in a polarized, sort of like fractured, divided state. So this essentially just sets the stage for other leaders who are essentially going to follow suit, right? So it says here leadership sets the ethical tone of a nation. Studies in moral psychology show that people unconsciously model their moral reasoning after authority figures, especially during times of uncertainty. When leaders act with integrity, restraint, and humility, they normalize ethical behavior across society. Conversely, when leaders display dishonesty, aggression, or moral inconsistency, these traits become socially contagious. The population does not merely disagree, it begins to mirror the leader's posture, increasing hostility, justification of wrongdoing, and moral relativism. Political psychology research shows that controversial leadership decisions are often experienced as threats to identity, not just disagreement over policy. People interpret leadership actions as attacks on who they are, especially when leaders use divisive language. This transforms political differences into existential conflicts. Groups begin to defend identity rather than ideas, making compromise psychologically impossible and deepening emotional polarization. Leadership detached from moral principles tends to operate from expediency rather than righteousness. This creates inconsistency. Decisions appear self serving, arbitrary, or opportunistic. Such leadership erodes trust. Once trust collapses, people stop engaging in shared civic life and retreat into ideological camps, accelerating national fragmentation. That's all this did. Now you're going to see more polarization with these ideological camps, more sort of like division into sort of like these politicized ideologies where people are just going to lose their humanity. This sort of like politicized, sort of like divisive culture is just going to pick up more steam based off of said actions recently and just on the accumulation of some of these decisions that are occurring in leadership. Research shows that leadership language strongly predicts levels of social cohesion. Leaders who frame oppositions as enemies, threats, or morally inferior activate fear based group psychology. This rhetoric legitimizes hostility at the grassroots level, encouraging citizens to avoid, shame, or dehumanize those aligned with opposing views. That's basically what you have going on now. Like people have already sort of made up their mind in terms of like which ideological camp they're going to identify with. Again, America is a country of extremism, really radical belief systems at the expense of a unified community and a culture. This has been shown for centuries. So it makes sense that you will have leaders that are just sort of like very radical in their approach to how they govern the nation. It says here when leaders justify unethical behavior, followers often reinterpret wrongdoing as necessary or righteous. This phenomenon, known as moral disengagement, has been extensively studied in social psychology. Over time, communities fracture as individuals excuse harm toward outgroups, believing that they are defending a higher cause rather than participating in societal breakdown. Institutions derive legitimacy from leadership integrity. When leaders appear corrupt or morally compromised, confidence in courts, elections, media, and governance declines. This institutional erosion pushes people to rely on tribal allegiance rather than shared systems, fragmenting national unity. Identity extremism emerges when political alignment becomes fused with moral worth. Leadership that rewards loyalty over integrity fuels this fusion. Once identity is politicized, disagreement becomes betrayal, and social relationships fracture along ideological lines. Under polarizing leadership, people increasingly avoid workplaces, churches, neighborhoods, and families that differ politically. Research shows that avoidance reduces empathy and increases radicalization. Avoidance prevents corrective dialogue, allowing extreme views to intensify unchecked. When leaders demand accountability from opponents while excusing their own failures, it creates moral cynicism. Citizens no longer believe in shared standards. This hypocrisy deepens resentment and drives populations further apart. So just wanted to do some of the psychological breakdown on some of the factors and variables that are going on in the US economy, socially, psychologically, spiritually right now. These are just sort of seeds planting into the population that are going to further sprout more of the same until there are discussions that are being had at the grassroots level. It doesn't just start at the top, it also starts with us. Thank you guys for tuning